Good evening. Good evening. And may I start by addressing myself to you students by saying that university would be a very poor place without you. And I think this evening also would not be possible without you. So thank you for showing up tonight. I'm glad to see you. And tonight we want to focus your minds, your brilliant minds, your curious minds on a very specific topic, the midterm elections in the United States of America. Americans vote on November 8th, and then I usually add, and the world is watching. Um, the, there is at the moment a slim 8-seat hold majority on the House in favor of the Democrats and an evenly divided Senate. The control by the Democrats of Congress is razor thin. When we head into these November midterm elections, current polls, if I'm correctly informed, favor Republicans to possibly retake the House, with the Senate, I guess, at this stage, too close to call. There are also multiple elections at the state level, 50 states, for functions such as, important functions, governor, very important, the governor of the state, secretary of state, and the state parliaments, or legislatures as they are called in the American system. And the outcome of these elections at state level could have an importance or an impact on the conduct of the presidential elections in 2024. So once the outcome of the elections will be known after the 8th of November, questions will be asked what the agenda or the remaining agenda of the current president of the United States, Joe Biden, can be for the remaining 2 years terms, 2 years of his term. What will be the agenda of the parties, the Republicans, the Democrats? What will be the implications for the economic policy of the United States, the relations with other countries, Ukraine, the future of American democracy, etc. Which races at state level are really critical, are important? And these are just a couple of questions that we had in mind when we took the initiative to organize this evening for you. And on behalf of the America Europe Fund, and also on behalf of my own course on transatlantic relations, we are grateful that Professor Dr. Leen Daelens has accepted to steer us tonight, to lead the discussion. Professor Daelens, for those who don't know, Professor Daelens is a full professor in communication science at the Institute of Media Studies, the Faculty of Social Science at KU Leuven. Her research interests, among many others, touch upon young people and upon social media use. She's also the chair, and I think that's where we met for the first time, of the Regional Committee North America of KU Leuven. So the two gentlemen she will have to control tonight in the debate is, if I may start with Steven de Voer, who is a journalist for a Belgian, Flemish newspaper called The Standard. He has been interested in the United States all his life. After he covered, if I recall correctly, the 9/11 attacks from New York for weeks in 2001, the general public came to know you, and I think also since that dramatic event, your interest became only growing, your fascination, your passion, I should say, and you're not only physically but also in the overall sense, a towering figure among the American specialists. And I would also like to mention the publication of some of your books, which I found really interesting on the United States. You just came back from the United States, so that would be also interesting for tonight's debate, to hear you about your findings. And last but not least, Professor Dr. Bart Keremans, who you probably know as the full professor of international political economy and American politics at the Leuven Institute for International and European Studies of the KU Leuven. Professor Keremans was also between 2013 and 2018 the Dean of the Faculty of Social Science. He's the author of several books also, and on American government. He is regularly consulted by the media in this country on issues related to American government and US elections, the topic of today. So Professor Keremans, Leen Danes, Steven de Voet, thank you so much for making yourself available for these wonderful students who really, I can testify to that, have very curious minds. So without further ado, I would pass it on to Leen Danes. Leen, don't forget to remind the students that there are drinks after the debate.
Yes. Well, thank you all for being here. Very welcome, a warm welcome on this Thursday evening, a couple of days, well, actually 2 weeks before November 8th. And I would like to start the conversation with these two US experts. And perhaps I would turn to my right-hand side for the first question. And I want to share it also with, of course, the journalist here in the room. Simple question: what is at stake in the November midterm elections? Is it a done deal, as was already a bit anticipated by Ambassador Wouters, or is there any suspense, any novelty, any surprise that we might anticipate?
First of all, I would like to thank Ambassador Wouters for organizing this event this evening. Certainly want to thank Leen and Steven as well for being in the panel, and of course students being present here, and a few other people being present here. And I want to introduce my answer with an observation about myself. I find it very intriguing that people continue to ask me questions about what I expect from an election in terms of the as an academic, I'm not that well acquainted with the technicalities of microphones. But anyhow, since the 2016 elections, I'm always surprised when people ask my opinion about what I expect from an upcoming election, because in 2016 I was completely wrong. And from that moment on, I started to pay attention to all kinds of predictions that are being made by what is sometimes called in the US the chattering classes. And I always try to avoid being part of the chattering classes, but I'm afraid I've become part of it anyway. So what I'm going to say about the things that I expect in terms of the electoral result, I wouldn't believe it myself, because basically I have been often wrong with my predictions about the outcome of the elections. Although I think that this year, in the case of the House, it's pretty simple, and the ambassador already referred to that. The only question that we basically have is what is going to be the margin of the Republican shift, or the Republican gains, rather, in the House of Representatives. And based on the polls that I've seen across different electoral districts, it's going to be somewhere between a net gain of 10 and a net gain of 36 seats. So that basically means that even under the worst scenario for the GOP, the Grand Old Party, that is the official name of the Republican Party in the US, even under the best scenario the worst scenario for the Republican Party, they would be able to gain the majority in the House of Representatives, meaning that then we will also get another speaker, Kevin McCarthy, maybe his name will pop up later on today, again, he's going to have a big job on his hands to manage his own caucus in the House. Not going to be very simple to do so, but anyhow, that is what I expect from the House. With respect to the Senate, and the ambassador also indicated that, it's really open. It really depends on a limited number of Senate races. Pennsylvania, where the Republicans could lose a seat, because it's an open seat now, and it's an open competition over there. Nevada, where the Democrats could lose a seat. Ohio, where the Republicans could eventually lose a seat. That is really an open race, at least according to the information that I have. Arizona, although I expect Arizona finally to fall to the Democrats. New Hampshire is also an open case, although I expect New Hampshire to fall finally to the Democrats as well. And I think that I covered them almost all, but not Georgia. And Georgia is also an open case and a specific case, because in the case of Georgia, if no candidate gets the absolute majority of the votes, there is going to be a runoff on December the 6th, and it could eventually then get us in a situation comparable with the situation that we had a little bit less than 2 years ago, where at the end of the day, the final decision about what the situation would be in the Senate could only taken after the runoff took place in Georgia. And it's certainly not to be excluded that we are going to have that situation again. It is not to be excluded that we remain in a 50-50 situation, or that the Republicans have a very small majority. I just don't know. It's too close to call, as has already been indicated. And then at the state level, based on the figures that I've seen, it's much more difficult to assess a situation at the state level, because there are much less opinion polls. And if you make predictions on the basis of opinion polls, individual opinion polls do not tell us a lot. It's rather when we see a consistent result showing up across different polls, across a certain time span, that we can talk about robust results. And that on the basis of that, we can really make reliable predictions or express reliable expectations with respect to an election outcome. And that was pretty hard for myself about 2016, but that is the approach that my group in Leuven used with respect to the 2020 elections, because we learned a lot from what went wrong in terms of predicting an outcome in 2016. And in 2020, we were really on top of what would happen. And that is because we paid much more attention to consistency or inconsistency, and therefore robustness in opinion polls. And that is a problem when we look at data with respect to state elections. Less opinion polls, and therefore less opportunities to make statements with respect to the expected outcomes. But I've seen in these opinion polls, and based on them, is that I don't expect major shifts to take place in terms of radical changes in individual American states in the direction of a state completely controlled by the Republicans, which is currently the situation with 25 states completely controlled by the Republicans, meaning that the governor and the houses of their state legislature, in most cases 2 houses, are under the control of the Republicans. And in 16 states, it is currently under the complete control of the Democrats. And what I've seen is basically that there could eventually be a shift in 3 states moving away from complete Democratic control, and 3 states eventually moving away from Republican control. And I'm talking about net results here. But once again, I'm very cautious with respect to results to be expected at the state level, because we have much less opinion polls, and that makes it more difficult to make statements based on robust polls. I'm going to leave it here for now.
Yeah, thank you very much. I remember when you were dean that you said, yeah, this prevented me from having boots on the ground, really, and that was partly the explanation why we didn't, you didn't really have the feel. So that's why you just came back from the States, so you can already anticipate my question. What did you hear? I mean, alongside the robust or not so robust polls, in which states did you go, or where did you travel to? Because it seems to be a very regional reality that is very different depending on where you look.
Yeah, and the weird thing is that somehow when you're thinking about where to go to with each new election, you want to avoid to be predictable, and you would so much want to go to some other states sometime at some point. I'd love to see Alaska or Hawaii or all these exotic places to become politically important at one point. But unfortunately, like every 2 years practically, it comes down again to the same states: Pennsylvania, Georgia, Arizona, more and more becoming politically important. Ohio, Florida, Georgia. So yeah, I mean, you can't do them all, but yeah, I did go to Ohio this time, to Pennsylvania, and to Georgia, and my colleague Roland Termote is going to Arizona and Texas. So yeah, those are a couple of the major ones. And the thing is, although I do think that it's important to have your boots on the ground and not just to add atmosphere to your stories in the newspaper, but just to sense how the situation is going. But a very good example of how you can be mistaken just by trying the temperature, the political temperature in a state, but at different places in the state. Is a good example of that is Pennsylvania. Everybody who knows about American politics knows that Pennsylvania is very much a state of two stories, where you have Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, two major cities, who are inhabited in a large part by either Afro-Americans or young, well-educated white professionals, which are both of them obviously not at a 100% level, but our majority speaking are much more leaning Democrat. Whereas when you go to the more rural parts of the state, and the more rural you get, the more conservative you're going to go. So it all comes down to turnout very often. Not so much people changing their minds, but how enthusiastic can you get your own base to show up at the polls. But now in this case, what I found very interesting was that even within one party, it could totally change. You have something very specific now going on. Let's say, maybe I should have started with this, but if there are actually two major points why we should be interested in these midterms. One is obviously who is going to have the majorities, and to what extent is the Joe Biden presidency going to be able to continue what it's trying to do, or what it has tried to do and did in the last 2 years, or whether it's going to be sabotaged by a total opposition. That's the one thing. That's logical. That's the same case with every midterm elections. That same question pops up. But the other one is what we have been watching in the Parliament, the House committee, searching for the larger question actually behind the insurrection on the Capitol on January the 6th last year. Where, as you probably have heard, there has been a lot of clues and evidence about the events of January the 6th not being just the events of that day, but being part of a much larger scheme that frankly amounts to attempted coup by Donald Trump and his cronies who didn't want to accept the results and who have been trying to change the results of the election in so many ways, for instance, by pressuring people on local levels, the people like the Secretaries General and other people involving with actually counting the results. Very famous was his call that has actually been recorded. So if you've never heard it, listen to it. The call Donald Trump made to Brad Raffensperger, the Secretary General in Georgia, who, by the way, was elected as a Republican and still feels like he's a Republican, but he's also a civil servant. And so Trump was pressuring him, and at a certain point says, but all I'm asking you is to find me 11,000 votes. Because it's something that, well, when he used to be a business tycoon, that people just did that, but in politics it's a little bit more difficult. So in this case, what they are trying to do is the next time at the 2024 elections, to have people on those crucial in those crucial functions, like for instance as a Secretary of State, have people who are extremely loyal to Trump or to Trump-like candidates who actually believe that the last elections have been stolen, and they really, whenever someone would say, find me 11,000 votes, would just do it. And so that the fact that in lower positions now, these elections are also about who is going to perform those duties in a couple of years, is in fact an attempt to prepare a better stage coup the next time. Now, very interesting about Pennsylvania is that there, okay, you have a very interesting Senate race, important for who is going to be in control of the Senate, between Mehmet Oz, a famous TV physician, and John Fetterman, a very peculiar kind of Democrat, new style. But the other race there involves Doug Mastriano, who of all the people, the election deniers, the 100% I'm pro-Trump kind of people, self-appointed Christian nationalist, he's the one who's actually said that when he becomes governor, that he gets to decide who the electors for his state are going to be. Whenever he finds in 2024 that there's something that doesn't please him about the results, that he thinks is a little bit fishy, he wants to disregard the election results and send the electors for Pennsylvania to Washington himself, which is frankly totally anti-democratic. Now, sorry, I'm taking a long time. Just coming back to where you go in Pennsylvania. So first, I spent a morning at the local headquarters in a rural town for the GOP, people coming there to get their front yard signs and to enlist, actually. And I was appalled. I saw no enthusiasm at all for Mehmet Oz, so the Republican guy for the Senate, who to a certain extent we could more or less still call a moderate within the Republican Party. But they were all adamant that they were totally in favor of Mastriano, who is a would-be dictator. And then you get really nervous about, if this is really the climate here, what are we underestimating again? Is this 2016 all over again? But then you move to the suburbs of Philadelphia. Suburbs of Philadelphia are famous for their swing voters. So you have rural equals conservative and Republican. You have the cities equals Democrats and liberals. So it's basically always in the suburbs that the elections are decided. And then there I met quite a lot of people who said, yes, I do want to vote for Oz. But Mastriano, are you kidding me? I'm a Republican, or at least I used to be, but I'm not going to vote for mad people. So it all comes down. It's so fragmented that it all comes down on turnout. How many people are going to show up for which party, or even for which faction within the same party?
Interesting. I've been looking, because I'm interested in media. I've been looking at the media content here a bit in Flanders at more or less 10 newspapers, and okay, we are 2 weeks before the midterms, and I counted 91 articles over the last months, and we had a little conversation over the email in preparation to this talk here, and you said, well, we have at least the magazine, the Standard magazine, and of course the Standard is the quality newspaper in Flanders, so I was just looking at news stories, and there I found particularly little interest in it. Okay, it's the US, it's not here, but still the US, we always look a lot and we scrutinize what happens there. Is there also, and I ask it also to Professor Karamanz, is there some sort of a resignation, can I call it that way, that perhaps is, although there's polarity for sure, is there also resignation with regard to this election, or am I getting it wrongly?
Are you talking about the Belgian media now?
The Belgian media, and also perhaps in the States, because I'll be looking also. But the Belgian media first. Let's.
Well, I don't know.
You look at the
I don't work on the Belgian media. Neither do I on the American media, by the way. I'm of course a consumer of a lot of material from the U.S. media across the political spectrum. I've seen traces of that email communication, and I was surprised a little bit because what I've seen this year for the midterm elections, in terms of the attention being paid by the U.S. media to these elections, I don't see a difference with the situation 4 years ago. Of course, we are now getting in a stage where the attention is rapidly increasing because we get closer to the date of these elections as well. I've seen a lot of attention going on for the primaries, specifically the question to what extent candidates endorsed by Donald Trump or candidates seeking for Trump's endorsement would be elected among the Republicans. Specifically also, and that's a very interesting thing this year, the fact that Democratic or committees, financial committees affiliated to the Democratic Party, or at least sympathetic to the Democratic Party, bought time on television advertisements in order to support the more extreme candidates based on the reasoning that these extreme candidates would lose the general election anyway, so that it was a good thing in case these extreme candidates would be elected in the Republican primaries. And a primary, just to be sure that everyone is on board, a primary is basically an election through which a political party decides who is going to be the nominee, the candidate of that political party in the next general election, and the general election is the real election. And so we've seen that within the Democratic Party, and certainly among Democratic sympathizers, there have been efforts made in 9 states to actively support candidates that they consider to be very extreme, and therefore they believe that these candidates would not be able to win the general election. And we don't know whether they are right or wrong. We don't know what's going to happen on November the 8th, or already is going on because early voting is already taking place. And whether these Democratic sympathizers and sponsors made a big mistake, or whether they were right. We will see what's going on. But that is indeed a very confusing situation. And I think that interesting about the elections this year, and I think that Steven already referred to that implicitly, not only implicitly, one of the big questions is, with regard to these elections, is what is the influence that Trump can exert on that party based on the success that his candidate, whatever it means, his candidates will have in the upcoming elections. That is a crucial question. And then a related question to that is also, we have a lot of election deniers that are running for the Republican Party currently. Most of them are running in relatively safe Republican districts, most of them, not all of them, but most of them are running in safe districts. But the question is, how deep is their belief in election denial? How deep is that belief? We've seen throughout the campaign that some of these Republican candidates have tried to get Trump's endorsement, but for the rest to keep him away from their own campaigning. Because always talking about the 2020 election is something that is basically taking the attention away from the issues about which the Republicans believe that they can really win the election with, which is the record of the Biden administration, and most specifically inflation, because that is the topic that really is of concern to most Americans. And then secondly, the question of immigration, and third, the question of crime, but certainly inflation. Yeah? So they've tried to keep the issue of the 2020 election more or less away from their active campaign, because they were afraid that specifically voters that are concerned about inflation but want this whole topic of the 2020 election to be finally ended, to be finally concluded, that these voters would run away from them in case they would start or continue to talk about the 2020 election. And that is an additional element of uncertainty in the elections this year.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Let's talk a little bit, you brought it up already, what the big issue is in the midterms, Inflation Reduction Act. So what are the other topics? You talked about migration. Isn't it dependent on, of course, the state? Like look at abortion, for instance. It's an issue in certain states, more so than in others. So how would you see that across the board?
I think the difference from state to state is not as big as it used to be, because you can really tell how Fox News is famous or infamous, but there is an entire community of other very right-wing populist media that has grown over the last specifically over the last 5 years, going in the same vein of and the same rhetoric as Fox News, and you can very much hear when you're talking to voters what has recently been on top of the priority list of those media. It's an incredibly polarized country, so basically it's the heads of the Fox Newses of this world who decide what is going to be top of mind of the Republican voters. Certainly the most convinced of them, and that's very strange because, for instance, let's say last year around this time, even the first months of this year, you still had the impression that the big topic for the Republican Party was going to be things like critical race theory. That was a bit of a ghost topic, I would say. The idea that the wokest Democrats are trying to poison the minds of your children, that they don't do anything but telling young children at the age of 8 or 9 that if they're white, that they're actually very bad because of what their ancestors did to the black children, or that they can still decide later whether they want to be boys or girls. Or I mean, we have some of that debate in Belgium as well. But there was something that Fox News was pushing very much, and you immediately heard that in the conversations. And now it pops up every now and then, but it's not even in the top 5 of their priorities anymore. So it's very much media directed, and it's very clear how the Republican Party and Fox News and others are coordinating there in a certain way. So, for instance, that with the amount of damage the inflation is doing in the United States and people, I mean. Famously, it has been said by Bill Clinton, it's the economy, stupid, but that is still the case. So they really decided, hey, people are suffering from high gas prices, and now the gas prices went down a little bit. We're still suffering from just high prices whenever they go shopping. So let's make that the big focal point, and let's claim that there is only one responsible for that. That is Joe Biden and his party. Like Professor Keremans just said, crime is a big second, and immigration has become an evergreen. And what have the Democrats to Yeah, to fight for, to root for, there has been a problem. There has been disappointment in the Joe Biden presidency, which is also pretty classical, because what happens during presidential elections that is you promise a lot and then suddenly find that your majorities in Congress aren't that big. So it took quite a while, a year and a half more or less, before the Biden administration finally came up with some decent legislation. Actually, quite a lot in the last half year or so. But somehow, and I think they made a big mistake there. Let's say that in the spring of this year, it seemed it was going to be a massacre. Biden was hugely unpopular. The inflation was very big. So they were looking at losing both chambers of Congress, and certainly in the House, really hemorrhaging votes. Very bad situation. They didn't really know what to do, what to come up with. What happened then? The famous famous case for the Supreme Court where they banned Roe v. Wade and changed the abortion situation, where actually for 50 years people in the United States got used to. So they immediately saw, logically, that this was going to be an enormous tool to get liberal people and more enthusiastic about showing up to vote. The problem is that in this incredible, nasty fight between the two parties, that is much more about attack ads, both on TV and on social media, than about anything you're going to learn about in normal mainstream news media, that abortion was their big thing, and is what they spent practically all their money on, neglecting to tell people what important things, really important things for common people, like finally getting the drug prices down, or helping students to pay for their college debts. Or having finally, for the first time in years, a pretty important gun control law, and obviously for us also very important, a huge investment in the fight against climate change. All those things have happened this summer, and apparently, I just read it last week, about 1 out of 3 Americans even know about those things. So if the Democrats made a big mistake, I think it's certainly communication-wise.
Anything to add to that?
No, I don't think I have anything to add. I
Mhm.
completely agree with that.
Mhm.
Of course, it's partly. It's certainly. I agree with the fact that they really made a mistake with respect to communication. I think that when the Dobbs versus Jackson ruling came on abortion, I think they really believed that would be the case that could save them in the midterm elections this year. And they have been concerned about those midterm elections. And if there has been a difference now with, for instance, the situation 4 years ago, the previous midterm elections, then it is the following. I don't know whether you agree with that, Stephen, but that is that the Democrats from the beginning in the 117th Congress were concerned about losing the midterm elections. Mm-hmm. From the beginning, that has been kind of an obsession, which of course I understand. There was the big shock that when in 2020 Joe Biden was elected as president, that nonetheless the Democrats lost seats in the House. They lost 13 seats in the House. That was really the big surprise. That was a kind of a shock for them. And then you have this very narrow situation, 50-50 in the U.S. Senate. And the fact that they have in their own party, they had most difficulties that they had, the Democrats, was in their own party with a number of senators in their own party. And that basically created the kind of a paranoia for what was going to happen in November 2022. And it seems that it is kind of a self-fulfilling, or is becoming kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. But of course, it is for the party of the incumbent president always very difficult in a midterm election. If we look at the figures since the Second World War, on average, the party of the incumbent president has lost 26 seats in the House of Representatives and 4 seats in the Senate. And with respect to the House, there are only 2 exceptions. That is in 1998, in a very specific context of the Republican overreach in the Lewinsky scandal, and then in 2002, and that is due to 9/11, which was already mentioned earlier. That was a very peculiar year, I would say. But if you are president, there are basically 2 things that happen when you've been in office for 2 years. The first one is already mentioned by Stephen. You have all these promises coming up, and then people realize that a significant amount of these promises could not be kept within, or could not be kept to the extent that they expected, or within the time frame that they expected. So that's the first problem. And secondly, well, yeah, the buck stops here. It stops in the Oval Office. So basically, people are going to blame you for things for which maybe you're not completely responsible. Yeah, well, you're the one in office. That's what happens when you are in office. Yeah? And that is, of course, now the situation with the Democrats. And at the end of the day, yeah, inflation is a big concern, and I completely understand that. It stands at this point at about 8.2% on an annual basis in the US. That is significant in terms of inflation. But at the same time, there are remarkable economic figures to present as well. Unemployment remains very healthy. At the end of the day, the economic situation in the US remains relatively stable. Yeah? Despite all the things that are going on, the price shocks due to the rising energy prices, the supply chain problems, the Ukraine war that comes on top of it. So economically, the situation is remarkably stable, but inflation is something that is felt by the whole population. Yeah? And that basically means that it's not just the people that lose their jobs, the poorest people, but also the middle class that gets angry. And it is very difficult to explain this. And Biden has tried to bring it as, this is Putin, this is the problem that was created by Putin, but clearly a large part of the voters doesn't seem to follow that kind of analysis completely. Yeah? And therefore, they have this inflation case on their hands. Yeah.
If I may add something to that, I'm just guessing, I'm not quite sure, but most of the people here are Belgians, right?
No.
But
it's an international crowd.
It's an international crowd. Okay, well, or not Americans, because I think what I'm trying to say is true for most countries in the world, but just not for the U.S. And certainly in a tiny country like Belgium, is that even if people suffer from huge inflation, there is a kind of modesty among the general audience that, well, if the inflation is high, few people are going to blame Alexander De Croo, our prime minister. We all know that our politicians are somehow a plastic ball on a big economical geopolitical ocean. That's something that's definitely not true in the United States, where a lot of people don't know a whole lot about what's going on in any other country anyway. And so the immediate reasoning that, hey, the prices went up, hey, Mr. President, do something about it. You're the guy in power. And don't give me any explanations. You're the one who we voted in power. Do something about it, or you will have to reckon with the consequences. And well, the consequences are pretty steep, certainly now. And I'm just guessing that that's also the main reason for the paranoia Bart Kermans was talking about. That even if it has always been the case that the opposition wins, and often big time during midterms, it used to be that, okay, you had a president from party A, and after 2 years you had party B controlling Congress, but it used to be a bit of a balancing act. And in recent times, let's say starting with Newt Gingrich in the 90s, but certainly with the Tea Party at the end of the Nillies, and now with Trumpism, is that we're not talking about normal opposition anymore. It's fanatic sabotage. It's like really they're not going to get one. The president is not going to get one law past us, even if we think and even if we know that our voters think that it's a logical thing to do. No, we are not going to work together with the other side. So you would get paranoid because you realize that what already happened to Barack Obama in 2012, or actually even in 10. Obama was elected the first time in 2008. In 2010, he lost his majority, and in 2012 again. And we all know that Obama is obviously a very, very good talker. He did some excellent things in his first 2 years. And unfortunately, he didn't get very much done anymore in the other 6 years just because of this phenomenon. So yeah, it is quite a big deal if you lose the majority, much more than it used to be in, let's say, the 60s or the 70s.
Thank you. Let us maybe now, for a few minutes, turn to international policy. And the name of Kevin McCarthy was already brought up by Professor Kermans. And I'm thinking of the relationship, for instance, policy with regard to Ukraine, for instance. And I read in one of the newspapers recently that he indicated that the US will no longer give a blank check to Ukraine if his party gains control of Congress. So, and also within the Democrats, there's 30 liberals who also were already trying to, nuance a bit the stance of the Biden administration. But what do you think of this? What to expect?
Well, I think there are two interpretations. Let me start with the Kevin McCarthy statement. Kevin McCarthy is going to be the next speaker in case the Republicans, which is very probable, are going to win a majority in the House of Representatives. And he made that statement, indeed, that in the context of an economic recession, they are not going to write a blank check for support to Ukraine. There are two interpretations, and both of them are valid, I think. There is part of the Republican Party which is really against massive American support for Ukraine in the war. And the reasons may be different. One reason is that some among them believe that the US has nothing to do with that problem that exists in Europe, and that it is in the first place a problem for the Europeans. The second one, and that is related to that it is once again a problem of burden sharing, or rather the lack of burden sharing. Namely that the US is paying most of the money for the weapons that are being delivered to Ukraine, and that European countries are more or less playing the role of a free rider. I'm not saying that that is the case, but that is the way in which the debate is being presented. So you have a group of countries, that's a group of people within the Republican Party that really say, you know, this war is not about us. We have nothing to do with it. Why should we pay? And if it is a problem for Europe, Europe should pay for it and not we. Yeah. That's the first group. The second group is the group that says, we know that the Biden administration really wants to continue that support for Ukraine, that it is a fundamentally important issue for the Biden administration, for the US government. To the extent that that is the case, that gives us a bargaining chip. If something is very important for your political opponent, that political opponent is probably going to be prepared, or at least you can push that political opponent, to pay a lot for what that political opponent really wants, which is in the case of Biden, the Biden administration, continue to deliver weapons and financial support to Ukraine. Yeah? And my interpretation with respect to Kevin McCarthy, of course I cannot look in his brain, but anyhow, is that that statement tries to satisfy first the first group, and secondly is basically preparing the budgetary debates that are going to take place. It's going to be a kind of how to say that in decent English?
A blackmail game?
Yeah, blackmail game. I was looking for that word. For me, it's pretty clear that that is the strategy that they're going to follow. It's not new. The Republicans have been doing that during the Obama administration as well. Look at how they linked budgetary issues, spending cuts, tax cuts, etc., how they linked it to approving a new debt ceiling for the United States, almost triggering a financial crisis, not just for the US, but internationally. So they are prepared to do that, and that is certainly something that is, again, on the table. It's going to be on the table. And I interpret McCarthy's statement as a signal to the Biden administration that they're going to play hardball in these negotiations by using the financial support for Ukraine on the one hand, and secondly, he's also catering, of course, to that group of Republicans that he needs, the support of which he needs in order to become Speaker.
Yeah, actually, a good example of this, whatever is important for the other party, we want to do the exact opposing thing, is the well, not the best moment in the Biden administration, but the rather scandalous retreat out of Afghanistan, which obviously we've all seen the images of people dropping from planes, and it was all very sad affair. All the more sad since Biden, just a short while before that, was adamant that such a thing was not going to happen. So, but then you immediately see the criticism of the Republicans are scandalous. How was this ever possible? Whereas Biden actually, in at least a little bit more prepared way, was doing the exact thing that Trump had been promising to do in an even much more abrupt way. So even when you do what the other party wanted to do in the first place, but it turns out to deliver not so nice images of what's happening in the field, and then that immediately becomes a strategy of hurting the other side. Still, because we're talking now about Russia and about Putin and the Ukraine, it's pretty difficult for them because on the one hand, you have indeed this sentiment that Biden and the Ukraine are close to each other, so you should be rooting for the other guy. Certainly, also because Trump and Putin seem to get along pretty well. But on the other hand, the images of what's happening in the Ukraine, they are even shown on Fox News. And so, for instance, Tucker Carlson, the most infamous of all the Fox News presentators, the one who actually has been talked about quite a lot already, that he might be running for the presidency at some point. But Tucker Carlson is the one who, for a long time, and even to a certain extent still today, is still saying, oh, why are we so much against Putin? Maybe Putin should be our guy. And I get the impression that that is hurting his popularity and probably his political future as well. So although I doubt very much how much common sense there is still left in people who watch Fox News all the time, but still the war images of the situation in Ukraine, I mean, that's even pretty emotional for a lot of people. So
yeah, so we kind of feel it also here, the polarization. So America is torn apart, the population is torn apart, and it really depends on the media they use. Here you can see that on average, people, apparently according to surveys, consult 6 news media between 20 and 50. About youth, that's something else, but the active population has still rather varied media menu. So given the fact that America is torn apart, and actually for me the metaphor of this polarity is a bit Kyle Rittenhouse. This Kyle Rittenhouse figure, the 17-year-old boy who had a gun and shoot 2 protesters with that gun. And for some media, like for Fox Media, he was a hero, and for other media like CNN, he was a criminal, a murderer. So how should we read the slogan that is in several states now, vote as if your democracy depends on it? How should we read it? Because that's one of the uniquenesses of this election, right? And you brought it up several times. I think the media play a role in this polarity. And how can we try to remedy this? What should be done in terms of journalism, journalistic infrastructure, or maybe other frameworks like the one that we set up now in Europe on media governance, like the Digital Services Act? Actually, by the way, today it was published. So is there a way out for this polarization? What do you see from your different visions, different experiences?
It's going to be very difficult. Because at the end of the day, polarizing pays, and that's what we've seen in the US, specifically on the Republican side, not only on the Republican side, but certainly more on the Republican side than on the Democratic side. It pays. And it pays partly because for politicians, or rather for a number of voters, positions that, or the loyalty that they show vis-a-vis a political party, or rather candidates, has become an identity question. It's not that much about issues anymore, but rather about identification with a person or with a movement. And then it becomes very difficult to decide to vote for another party. We see on the basis of research that the role of so-called negative partisanship has become much more stronger than the role of positive partisanship. And that basically means you vote not so much for a party, but you vote against another party, making it very difficult, of course, to switch in your voting behavior from one party to the other, and secondly, making it very important to the candidates of that party to try to attract your vote by increasing the kind of polarization, which rewards them. And on top of that, you have then the primary system in the US as well. And the primary system, certainly on the Republican side, it's a little bit more ambivalent on the Democratic side, but on the Republican side, yeah, there is a rising fear among, let's say, more moderate mainstream Republicans. That is a group that is basically shrinking when we are talking about elected officials. There is really a fear that in case they do not sufficiently follow in this polarization, that they are going to be punished in the primaries, that they are going to get a more extreme candidate in the primaries within their own political party, that candidate is going to win the primary, and they are going to lose their seat. Their seats, let's hope not their suit. That would be very funny and cold probably for them as well. But that is the big concern that they have. And that reinforces, of course, the polarization that we already have. And on top of that, you have the social media, but I'm not a media expert. You are, I'm not a media expert, so I'm very, very cautious when I'm saying this, but the development of the social media makes it easy for people to lock themselves up in their echo chambers, which is very human, by the way. We also like to find things that confirms what we already think, what we already believe. I always say, being right is nice, but being wrong is more interesting. But it's much more difficult. Yeah. It's much more difficult to be wrong. Yeah, you want to have the confirmation of what you think and not the denial or the contradiction of that. But anyhow, social media makes it easy to lock yourself up in those echo chambers, and you already referred to that. The fragmented and polarized nature of the American media also makes it easy to just look at those television channels that confirm or reinforce what you already thought, and that's much more comfortable than trying to look for information that contradicts you. Yeah.
Looking for balance, yes.
Yeah. Until a couple of years ago, the Belgians here know about her. She's retired now, but until a couple of years ago, we had a news journalist called Martine Tange. And when Martine Tange said something, and everybody agreed, she was so wise. She was even emotionally wise, not adding too much. I mean, you're a news presenter, but just that small touch of compassion sometimes. I mean, everybody digged Martine Tange, and she doesn't have a real successor yet, but still people watch the news, not every day, but at the end of the month, like you said, they're using 6 media, yes, and one person is a bit more politically liberal, and the other one is a bit more conservative, and yes, there are extremists in our country too. But it's limited because there is a general idea of both domestically and internationally without too much silly crap, you more or less know what's going on. And that's the case in most Western European countries, and by the way, in a lot of other countries in the world as well. The problem with the United States is they used to have that. They had Martin Tanger. He was called Walter Cronkite. He was the guy who told us that President Kennedy had been murdered and that man walked on the moon. And nobody said on social media, Walter Cronkite, apparently he's a lefty or is he a righty, or it was true because he said so. There's no such thing anymore. And how do you get that back? It's a very, very hard thing to do. And then there is not just the fact that there is very poor use of, let's say, proper quality mainstream media, although they have obviously incredibly good media. But the percentage of people who use them is much lower than in Western Europe. And with that lack of real information, obviously social media, but also the attack ads that are all over the place, they are really the main source of information. The gossiping, the really nasty stuff both parties are saying about each other. Actually, GOP is worse than the Democrats, but they're both attacking each other in sometimes very vicious ways. So how do you stop that? One first real solution could be, but then the Democrats would have to have a majority for that. Just skipping back 12 years now, in 2010, the Supreme Court had a ruling that has really poisoned American politics. In 2010, the Supreme Court decided, they said, well, until now there's been a cap on the amount of money that large organizations, large companies, or wealthy people could give to politicians or political parties. There's been a cap because we thought, well, if they hand you a really large bag of money, they're probably going to ask something in return afterwards. But in 2010, they decided, well, they've invented something new. It's called a PAC or a super PAC, a political action committee. And well, we don't see any reason why they shouldn't be allowed to accept as much money as they want. This regarding the fact, obviously, that a PAC or a super PAC is like it's the mailbox of the politicians. There's an immediate line going to the politicians themselves. But so by abolishing that cap, within 10 years, the amount of money spent on American politics had gone tenfold, 10 times as much in 2020, and now it's even worse. I don't know the current amount, but 10 times as much money as in 2010, which is the reason why a lot of people in the States, whenever there's an election coming up, they don't watch television anymore, because by the time that the political ads are over, you don't know anymore where exactly you were in your favorite soap series, because it's incredible the amount of time that and money that is being spent on these really vicious attacks of the two parties. And obviously that also adds to the sentiment of I don't like politics and politicians.
Okay, I'm sure you're dying to ask a question yourself here in the audience. So now is the time. It's past 8. It's 8:08. So feel free to ask a question, please. Is there a microphone? Yeah. Okay, great.
So what baffles me is that disingenuous positions are not penalized anymore. That's my impression. Just 2 examples. A number of Republican senators and congressmen are apparently campaigning in their districts based on the beef they brought home with the infrastructure plan, which they voted against without any... I mean, how dare you do such a thing? And apparently they get away with this. There is one race where one candidate who is very clear that there should be marital fidelity. It turns out he has fathered a couple of children with several women. He is completely opposed to abortion, but he paid his girlfriend to have an abortion. He has misrepresented his academic record. He has misrepresented his time with the police. He pulled out a fake police badge during a debate to support his false claim that he had served as a police officer. So, and he seems to get away with that because he's only trailing by a few points to his opponent. And so I'm baffled that these things, which are pretty egregious, are not penalized by the voters. So can you give an explanation for that?
Yeah, I share your fascination with that fact. But for me, it's a consequence of this identity question to which I referred earlier. And it is basically the idea that what comes from, the kind of information that comes from those that do not belong to the group with whom you identify, that information is not the real truth. That's the whole question about alternative truth. Yeah. That makes it extremely difficult to get information across that may be very important for the voters concerned, and you refer to these inconsequences with respect to the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act and with respect to abortion and et cetera. In the case of Georgia, clearly referred to the Georgia Senate race. But if you are in this logic of we versus them, everything that comes from them, you will lock that out. That is information that you don't want to trust. You don't want to even listen to that kind of information because it's, in your eyes, suspicious and therefore, by definition, not true.
There's something new I've noticed now that I hadn't noticed in past elections. That is that, yes, you have the tendency of blocking out all the information that would not suit you or your party. But now, well, obviously with Trump, for instance, I mean, the parliamentary committee, the congressional committee on January 6th had actually surprisingly high ratings. A lot of people were watching them, and what they did very well was have the accusations made by Republicans, not by Democrats. Which made it all the more difficult to act as if nothing had happened. And so, yes, and you get these more and more outrageous kind of candidates like Doug Mastriano, I told you about in Pennsylvania, the guy who wants to become governor and then decide for himself what the election result is going to be instead of the voters. Those things are beyond defending in any kind of way. A lot of people still do. But I had a conversation this time with the guy who was running the local headquarters in this rural town in Pennsylvania. And so I started about Mastriano. And this guy was actually a kind of reasonable kind of person to a certain extent. And I said, I said, how can you, there's something you can't explain away. How can you possibly be campaigning for someone who says that he's not going to follow the election result, that he's going to appoint his electors himself? And then he went suddenly like hand-wringing, like, I realize that's a very tough one. But what you don't see is how bad the situation is. I mean, if the situation is so bad that you sometimes have to pull dirty tricks, because otherwise, I mean, you don't realize these Democrats, they want to ruin the country. They want to ruin our economic, they want to ruin the actual base of what it is to be an American. So they turn it out into be such an evil competitor they're running against, that although they do start, or some of them do start acknowledging now that what they are doing is cheating, but that the cheating itself is legitimized by the alternative, which is that the other guys, the evil guys, would be running the show for a couple of more years. It's very hard to run a democracy in that way.
Any other question?
Yes. Well, having lived in the U.S. myself, every once in a while I do tend to try to see it from their position. And if I look at what we've been discussing over the past hour, you have to admit there's a lot of U.S. bashing that has gone on, right? So, and this is something that I did see, or that I felt coming back from the U.S. is this European attitude to, let's say, take ourselves as a reference and then judge the rest of the world. Okay, not saying the US isn't doing that, but in any case, we have a pretty bad case of that. And so when we're talking about polarization, for example, so obviously the US is polarized, et cetera, let's take an example. And I don't have the numbers, and I'm making a hypothesis, but my hypothesis would be, if we compare the US situation and legislation being voted in Congress, and we compare that to the Belgian situation, I think there has been more, even over the last months and years, more bipartisan legislation that has been voted than there has been legislation voted in the Belgian parliament, otherwise than majority versus minority. And that is something to think about. So it doesn't mean that because we have more parties, that were essentially superior for that. Actually, with every election, you hear people saying, well, maybe we should have a two-party system, would be a lot more efficient. We wouldn't spend 500 days finding a government. So I think we're taking a little bit too much of a, let's say, European take on this. I do think that worldwide people are coming to the conclusion that the position of or the view of the voter as a rational actor is overrated. And that is, I think, what is happening. And we do see two flavors of it, both in Europe and in the US. And I'm not necessarily convinced that one is superior over the other. So that's an observation.
It's a very interesting observation, although I want to add myself that I personally never, but you didn't claim that, but just to be clear myself, I don't think that our system is superior to the US system. That's not the way in which I look at the world. That would be very uninteresting and probably dysfunctional for an academic. You didn't say that, but just to make that point clear. But the comparison between Belgium and the US, it's always risky, of course, to compare these two. A factor that plays a role, it's a subtle factor maybe, is an institutional factor. You're referring to majority versus opposition, but the majority doesn't always look the same here. It's at the end of the day a majority that is being formed on the basis of a coalition government. And it basically means that you have a lot of compromising going on among these different parties when they take a position in parliament. And the game is indeed that the opposition is going to go against it, because of course they want to be in office. And when they are in office, in many cases, they are in a coalition agreement with some of the parties that, were their opponents in the previous legislature. The American electoral system is a system that basically triggers, stimulates, causes, generates the bipolarization of your party political landscape. And in such a situation, polarization may become rewarding, and that's what we currently see is happening in the United States. That would be my answer to your comparison between what's going on in this country and in the US, without claiming that what's going on here would be better or worse than what is going on in the United States. I am concerned, by the way, about certain developments in the United States. And my big concern is that what we do see with one of these two political parties, that is that part of the strategy of that party, in order to be successful in terms of getting access to elected offices, is to play with the system itself, with the democratic system itself, trying to keep people away from the voting process. That is, from a democratic angle, hugely problematic. disputing in an unfair way the outcome of an election, not accepting the outcome of an election, that is from a democratic angle an extremely problematic kind of situation. For me, in these kind of issues, there is a big problem that one way or the other, I hope the US is going to face.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think what you just said, I would have agreed with, let's say in the 90s or in the Nillies or something. But after what's happened in the last 14, 15 years now, and certainly with Trumpism, is that you're adding a situation there that's way beyond the normal more left-wing or more right-wing kind of differences in policy ideas, but actually one party that is really trying in very many ways to undermine democracy itself. By the way, the United Nations has changed the status of the United States last year and is officially considered a democracy in danger now because of that. And I don't think we, in Belgium, obviously with our coalition politics and with all the difficulties of being a multilingual country, I realize we are the world record holders for being in the Guinness Book of Records for being the country that has spent for the longest time without a federal government. So I'm certainly not going to say that our system is ideal, but I cannot, and I hope I will never have to retract my words there, but I cannot foresee any situation where half of the population would condone undermining the democracy in that way.
Neither could anyone in the US 10 years ago.
True.
So let's be careful there.
Yeah.
Look at Italy, look at other examples.
I know, yeah.
Let's be humble.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. So, but in the interest of time, because I'm looking at my watch here, and I know there is still a reception downstairs, I think we should perhaps, continue our conversation with a glass, because it's a reception at ground level. And a big round of applause to our two debaters, US experts here. So let's continue the conversation 7 levels down, okay?
And I forgot the most important. You couldn't give it to yourself. Je kan het moeilijk aan jezelf geven.
Dank u.
Wil je dat doen?
Thanks a lot. Thank you.
Altijd een beetje.